Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment here, but I want to thank you all for joining the National Brownfields Coalition for an exciting discussion around opportunities for brownfield practitioners in 2022. We're at a really historic moment in brownfields with some of the recent federal legislation that has passed, the infrastructure bill, and what is coming down the road for us in the coming year. So we are thrilled to have you here with us today. We've got an exciting presentation for you, and we're eager to share how all of you can get involved with the coalition during this exciting time for brownfields remediation and redevelopment. My name is Mary Hasham. I am a founder of RE Solutions, Brownfield Redevelopment Company, also of Adapta, a small woman-owned business that does consulting in the brownfield space to municipalities primarily. And I have been in the brownfields space for approximately 30 years. So I've seen a lot of trends come and go, and I've seen a lot of waxing and waning. However, I will tell you, brownfields is one of the ultimate bipartisan issues facing us today, and I think our current legislature is rising to the challenge. We have a great list of speakers today, including Congressman Dan Kildee from Michigan's 5th District. We also have with us members of the Brownfield Coalition Steering Committee, Lee Alon and Michael Goldstein, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. You can submit any questions you have in the chat box anytime during the presentation. We're going to use the last 15 minutes of this hour to tackle as many of the questions as we can. If you have any questions about the technology or you're having any issues with using the webinar technology, please also put those questions in the chat box, and one of our support people will get back to you with some assistance. For members of the media, if you're joining us, you can arrange interviews through the email addresses provided in the registration page, and we'll also be dropping that information into the chat. Today's session is being recorded. We'll provide a recording of the webinar after we wrap up this afternoon. So let's get down to it. Throughout the next hour, we're going to be discussing some of the issues that the National Brownfields Coalition has been focusing on, including the Brownfields Redevelopment Tax Incentive Reauthorization Act and what the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law means for brownfields. And as you know, it means a lot. We are joined by 2 members of the National Brownfields Coalition Steering Committee who will provide insight on their work. First, Michael Goldstein from Goldstein Environmental Law. Michael serves as the chair for the coalition's Public Policy, Redevelopment Initiative, Incentives, and Regulatory Partnership Committee. We're also joined by Lee Alon from New York City's Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation. Lee serves as chair for the Membership and Communications Committee for the National Brownfields Coalition. The National Brownfields Coalition is a nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations and public and private sector professionals who develop and advocate for policies and practices that support the responsible cleanup and reuse of underutilized, blighted, or environmentally impacted land, aka brownfields. We advocate for protecting public and environmental health sustainably and equitably by removing or containing contaminants in the estimated 400,000 to 600,000 brownfield sites nationally. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and convene stakeholders nationally, as we're doing today, to advance the social, economic, public health, environmental, and quality of life benefits of environmental cleanup and brownfields reuse for all communities. The coalition is jointly managed by Smart Growth America and the Center for Creative Land Recycling, so CCLEAR. Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., working with communities across the country to create places that are safe, healthy, and resilient for all. The Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLEAR, promotes the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. Within the coalition, there are several committees that collaborate on a regular basis to advance the goals of the organization. These committees are the Public Policy, Redevelopment Incentives, and Regulatory Partnerships Committee, which, as I noted, Michael Goldstein leads, the Environmental Justice and Public Health Committee, the Advocacy and Outreach Committee, the Best Practices and Education Committee, and the Membership and Communications Committee. You can learn more about each committee's work and priorities and learn how to get involved with the coalition on the coalition's website. So with that as background, let's jump into the heart of our presentation today. We are really fortunate to have had an interview with Representative Dan Kildee. Dan, as you will see, Representative Kildee has been instrumental in advancing Brownfield priorities, both at the Michigan state level and nationally. And I think you're all going to be extremely excited by his comments. There is a lot going on at the federal level. We're just thrilled to have this recorded dialogue with him. We'll then follow up with a live dialogue with Michael Goldstein and Leah Lon and other leaders from the National Brownfields Coalition. Representative Kildee is interviewed by Jim Teschler from the Michigan State Land Bank Authority, who is a longtime member of the Coalition Steering Committee, and by Catherine Burgess of Smart Growth America. They lead a conversation with Congressman Kildee around the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law and new opportunities for Brownfield communities. So with that, let's listen to Jim Teschler and Catherine Burgess interview Representative Kildee.
Representative Kildee, on behalf of the National Brownfields Coalition, thank you so much for joining us for today's interview. I'm personally excited to hear what you have to say about this linkage between brownfields and the new legislation and financing and land banks. For the audience, my name is Jim Teschler. I am the Development Director for the Michigan Land Bank Authority here in Lansing, Michigan. And I'll now turn the floor to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Jim. My name is Catherine Burgess, and I'm the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. We're hosting today's webinar and interview conversation on behalf of the National Brownfields Coalition, which is jointly managed by Smart Growth America, SGA, and the Center for Creative Land Use Recycling, or CCLEAR. SGA is committed to advancing best practices in brownfield remediation and redevelopment. Everyone should have the opportunity to live in a neighborhood which is healthy, prosperous, and resilient, and cleaning up environmentally impacted land is one key strategy for supporting the development of vibrant and sustainable places. The National Brownfields Coalition is a nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations, as well as public and private sector professionals who develop and advocate for policies and practice that support the responsible cleanup and reuse of underutilized or environmentally impacted land. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and convene stakeholders nationally to advance brownfields redevelopment. We encourage all of our listeners to sign up to be a part of NBC and to build this coalition of practitioners to stay up to date on federal advocacy opportunities and funding opportunities related to brownfields. With that, I'll pass the mic back over to Jim to introduce Representative Kildee. Representative Kildee, thank you again for joining us today. We are so lucky to have the opportunity to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Congressman Dan Kildee from Flint, Michigan, holds various leadership positions in the Congress, including Chief Deputy Whip in the Democratic Leadership Team and the prestigious Ways and Means Committee. Before being elected to the Congress, Congressman Kildee co-founded and served as president of the Center for Community Progress, a national nonprofit organization focused on urban land reform and revitalization. He also founded Michigan's first land bank in Genesee County, which invested millions of dollars in redevelopment of brownfield sites in Flint, and has served as a model for over 100 land banks across the nation. He was a key player in the Michigan statute creating the State Land Bank Authority and the state's county land bank network. From personal experience and the many, many conversations, I can state with certainty that no one understands the issues of brownfields and land banks better. Congressman Kildee, welcome to today's conversation.
Thank you, Jim. It's good to be with you both. Thank you.
Here's our first question for you. Of course, every session is a busy session in the Congress. Well, I think this session has been exceptionally busy, as you probably can attest to, with all the infrastructure bill and the other actions going on. So what is your view on this brownfield funding opportunities in this infrastructure bill and the other federal legislation that is in front of us now?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question and for inviting me and for the work that you all do. It's obviously very much aligned with some of my past work and obviously continues as a result of some of the work we're doing in Congress. This legislation, the legislation that we've enacted itself is pretty transformational if properly utilized. Between the American Rescue Plan, which provided direct resources to communities, which obviously can translate in a lot of ways to the impact of the pandemic. A lot of that has to do with disruptions in the real estate market. We think there's some opportunities there, but very specifically in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was signed into law by the president on November 15. It takes a big step in tackling some of the legacy pollution problems that we see by significantly increasing money for brownfield cleanup, $1.5 billion for EPA's Brownfields program for cleanup, $3.5 billion for Superfund site cleanup, for assessment, for all of the aspects of that program, reinstatement of the Superfund tax, which has been gone since 1995 to discourage the use of these dangerous pollutants and to ensure that polluters pay. So in the bipartisan legislation, we were able to include those areas for which we had broad bipartisan agreement. And because Brownfield issues no boundaries, no partisanship, it's something that is a problem for urban and rural communities all across the country. We were able to get some progress there. My hope is that our ability to fully utilize those resources and others in the most distressed, most at-risk communities will be enhanced through some of the work that will be included in the so-called Build Back Better Act, which is passed the House of Representatives, which I helped to write. As you mentioned, I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee. A big chunk of that legislation came through the Ways and Means Committee. I'm on the Budget Committee. The whole thing came through the Budget Committee. But this particular legislation includes some provisions that I wrote that I think would be particularly helpful in using the entire array of federal sources and state sources, local sources, but also the specific new dollars. And it's a program that we put under the category of trade adjustment assistance. This is one of those sort of wonky policy programs. We have a program to help communities that are negatively impacted by big changes in the global economy, trade impact. I saw such a correlation between trade impacted communities and the communities that I've been working in for 2 decades that have significant abandoned sites, significant brownfields. Many of those situations are the result of big changes in the global economy, with the change in manufacturing in particular contributing to these abandoned sites. So our trade adjustment assistance program now includes a piece that we wrote, $1.2 billion, targeted for those communities that have faced the most chronic economic hardships. And I'll just quickly touch on what the money will do. Number one, critically, it helps those communities develop economic development plans. I mean, as we know, one of the big challenges for the most chronically distressed communities is the capacity at the local level to conceptualize, to formulate, and then to execute strategies to move them forward, to get back to the starting line where other communities are. So one big piece of this that we will rely on many of the folks that work within the networks that you represent is the development of strategic plans for these communities through the EDA. The eligibility for these programs will be essentially targeted at those communities that have an average income of 80% of the federal poverty line, persistent long-term poverty, significantly distressed by trade, no matching requirements for this particular program. And so that the assistance to develop the strategy will be followed with funding for demolition or rehabilitation of abandoned properties, cleanup of contaminated properties, funding for qualified land banks, construction of public facilities to improve public services. So essentially, you can tell I wrote this. It's the stuff that we've been trying to get for a long time. Preservation of historic properties, all the stuff that we always had the ideas for, but the lack of capacity at the local government to organize and execute, and the resources to actually put fuel behind those ideas is what this whole program is about. This is one of the reasons the Build Back Better Act is so critical that we get it over the finish line. It's a less controversial part of the legislation, but for the communities that we've been working in for a long time, this is really important.
Catherine, why don't you take next question?
Thank you so much, Rep. Kildee, and thank you, Jim. It is really exciting to hear more from you about this transformational federal funding opportunity and the current funding landscape. And what, in your view, are the best approaches to apply this federal funding? At SGA, we're poised to work with communities across the country as they seek to take advantage of this. But how can we ensure that the projects that are funded are, shovel worthy and are the most, exciting, transformational, and equitable projects rather than merely the most shovel ready?
Well, you put your finger on one of the problems that we have to acknowledge and have to do more to address, and that is, in the past, very often, when the federal government steps in to provide resources to support redevelopment, because of the nature of the federal government, there's this tendency to sort of be even-handed and put money out in a way that typically ends up rewarding the communities that have the highest capacity, the strongest private sector investment, both in terms of time and capital. And what I worry about is that many of these resources actually have the opposite effect that they're intended to have, in the sense that we continue to fuel growth in areas that have the greatest opportunity for growth. I've been particularly concerned about how the Opportunity Zone program has been potentially having this effect, and that it essentially rewards those places that are best positioned to take advantage of, of private investment. So the goal here, and the way we have to spend this money, is to disproportionately support those places that are struggling the most, that are chronically distressed. That's why the way we've done the trade adjustment assistance piece requires that communities receiving this support would previously have received trade adjustment assistance, but we're still stuck in this really difficult position. And that we waive the match requirements, another hurdle for many communities that are impoverished communities, that if they had the matching money, they'd be spending that on their needs right away. And this is where I think this network comes in. The capacity that you bring and the relationships that you all have with those communities on the ground have to be a part of this effort. So that's my hope, is that as we go to, assuming we get the Build Back Better legislation passed, and as we go to implement much of this, including my land bank legislation, that we engage the national and regional partners so that we're aligned, so that we're going into those communities to help them put together what we think is the most aggressive approach that they can utilize, and not falling into the trap of having federal resources or tax credits disproportionately fall in a way that the market would prefer. The market is going to always seek the most likely and highest return on its investment. And if we don't have our own values informing this work, we're going to see things actually get worse and not get better. I've been worried about this generally with infrastructure funding. If we look at the history of the United States, the last major investment in infrastructure coming out of World War II and into the 50s and early 60s, what we saw, unfortunately, is communities that were well positioned did really well. Communities that were struggling did not do so well. We can't let that happen again.
Well, Congressman, you've talked about a number of coalitions or linkages between groups here in your response, which we agree. One of them is right in your wheelhouse, which is land banks, as you and I have talked many times on this. So bringing those two concepts together, land banks and brownfield sites and the funding, do you have any particular thoughts about how the land bank network can take advantage of these brownfield funds, and vice versa, how brownfield redevelopers can take advantage of the land banks that exist, if they exist in your communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in Michigan, when we developed the land bank concept, as you know, Jim, we saw this connection. And we decided that as it relates to the Michigan definition of brownfield redevelopment financing, that we would define land bank owned properties as being brownfield eligible just because they happen to be land bank owned properties. And it helps us deal with really the contamination above grade as aggressively as the contamination that we see below grade. And sort of taking that definition, I think, is really critical. My view is we need to be more robust even in Michigan in embracing that connection. And I want to do everything I can to provide more fuel for states like Michigan that have the legislation, but then look at other places around the country where we can make this linkage between land banks, which is, I'm sure many of you know, give us the optimal authority to deal with this issue by not trying to impose our policy solutions on properties that other people own, but actually to take these most distressed properties into public ownership, no longer treat them as commodities to be bought and sold, but as an investment that, given the right set of tools, can have really positive externalities. And I think that's what's been missed in the absence of land banks. When a brownfield site, for example, is only viewed in its transactional value, it makes it really difficult sometimes to justify the kind of investment that it takes to prepare that site for redevelopment and to execute a redevelopment strategy. But with the land bank notion, because we think about the broad externalities of all of our investment, and we can connect properties to one another in terms of the economics of that market basket of property, suddenly properties that on their own would not justify the sometimes quite significant investment that it takes to get them developed, when looked at as part of an overall strategy and when connected economically to the other properties in a land bank portfolio, suddenly it makes sense again. And that's what we're really trying to do by making these connections between brownfields and the land bank concept, because the land bank concept looks at a whole of inventory approach and the whole of inventory economic model, as opposed to continuing to treat each property as if it has to stand its own in the market. If we do that, we consign far too many properties and far too many communities to a long-term reality of blight and abandonment with no real prospect of redevelopment. We can't let that occur. That's the big challenge, I think. And that's the connection between the two that's so critical.
Thank you. And I'd like to continue to hear you elaborate on this. You know, you've spoken a bit both about the opportunities from the infrastructure bill writ large and opportunities in the land bank community. Let's look more at brownfield redevelopment and the connections with the environmental justice movement. How do you see brownfield redevelopment as advancing environmental justice? And what would you like to share in terms of opportunities for policies to ensure that brownfield redevelopment does not lead to inequitable outcomes and gentrification and displacement?
I think it's a really important question. And I think we have to address it in two ways, but recognizing the reality that you have laid out is really important. To understand that the economic conditions in communities struggling with the challenges around, the sort of big challenges that environmental justice creates for us. These are the most distressed communities with the least likelihood of being able to get land use that is not going to contribute to more exposure to toxic pollutants in these communities. One of the ways to get there is to erase the connection between an ultimate development and the cleanup needs for sites. Because typically the way brownfield redevelopment works is you have to have a development project with private financing ready to go in order to justify the investment to do the cleanup. My view is that for many of these communities, what we need to do is advance cleanup. We have to clean up without the prospect of an immediate redevelopment on the horizon. This is difficult to do, but the truth of the matter is we're going to pay for this one way or the other. We're going to pay for the remediation when ultimately, perhaps in the future, some private investment does show up. We're going to pay for that, and it's a public responsibility that's going to be paid largely with public dollars. Or we're going to pay for it by continuing to see the impact of environmental justice unaddressed in these really weak communities. So my view is if we're all going to pay for it one way or the other, Let's pay for it in a way that has the optimal return for these most distressed, environmental justice challenged communities. And that means advance funding of brownfield remediation in the most distressed, least likely to be developed places. That's one really important piece of it. So more money pushing into brownfield remediation that is not so often directly connected to a potential development project. That's where we get, I think, the cart and the horse in the proper order here. That's cleaned up. Then we have the ability to develop in a way that's not going to have to reuse that property for yet another polluting sort of project. And that's the problem with brownfield redevelopment. Typically, we look for a use that reinforces the past use because it's an already dirty site and the cleanup requirements are fairly minimal to continue with another dirty use. The other, and this is sort of somewhat repetitive, but the other really important piece of it is to connect the brownfield refinancing with a regional, countywide, or the broadest geographic approach we can take to land banking so that we make that connection to a broader set of properties with stronger economic opportunity or prospects. And that helps us justify financially the cleanup of these sites and doesn't require us to continue this sort of downward cycle by continued reuse that is consistent with past use. This is what we have to unlock. This is why a different look at brownfield redevelopment that doesn't just get us remediating to the point where another dirty use can follow the last one is really important.
Yeah. Well, Representative, our last question builds again on what you've just talked about. This is a historic moment, as you've been saying. What call to action would you wish to share with the members of the National Brownfields Coalition, given what you've said this morning?
Well, one is do what you're doing right now. We have to educate our members across the country and activate them to reach out to their state and federal elected leaders and help explain that what we're talking about here is a market approach to a problem that has typically been considered some sort of an act of largesse or charity on behalf of these most distressed communities. I reject this notion. And I think this is really important to our messaging and really important to the call to action. I reject the notion that what we're asking for when we put these notions on the table is some sort of act of charity or largesse or bailout. What we're asking for is to give these most distressed communities the tools they need to more fully contribute to our economic future. And rather than continue to be seen as a problem to manage, as communities with a really high upside and great opportunity that not only makes a contribution to the growth of our economy in a way that's far more equitable, but erases some of the costs of distress, erases some of the costs of failure. I mean, I'm from Flint, Michigan. 60% of the children in Flint live in poverty. You know, this is unacceptable. We can erase much of that if we can unlock the value of that landscape, find ways to reinvest in it so that we can put those communities back into the economy, back to work. This is not just about land. This is about people and land and the connection between the two. And the fact that we do have a way to use the forces of the marketplace to address brownfield sites, to address distress, vacant and abandoned challenged properties in a way that rewards the people who live there with a future that's a lot brighter. This is about a strategy that embraces the market, not one that tries to fight the market. And if we can get that message, it will cover, I think, across the political spectrum, many of the concerns that people have about this sort of policy approach. That has to be the focus of our energy.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for your words, inspiring words this morning, speaking to the audience here. I have personally had, as you know, had the opportunity to talk with you many times and have heard and engaged with you in conversation. But I think for a national audience here in this webinar today, I think it's especially inspiring. So thank you for your time and your energy and your commitment to helping the brownfields and land bank networks grow across the country.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for all the great work you do. I look forward to being a partner for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We'll now be hearing from 3 leaders from the National Brownfields Coalition who will reflect on today's conversation and share opportunities to get involved going forward. Thanks again, Representative Kildee.
Thank you.
Wow, that was exciting. What a great interview. Lots of food for thought there. We're now going to turn to a little bit of a discussion here with Michael Goldstein and Lee Alon, and we'll use the remaining time to answer some of the questions. There's been a very robust dialogue going on in the chat. So we're going to open with a couple of things because I want to hear Michael and Lee's reaction to that interview. So Michael, let's start with you. What did you hear from Representative Kildee that resonated with you?
Mary, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Lee. And the first thing I want to say is I love Rep. Kildee's sense of urgency. His words, this is unacceptable, what's going on across the country in terms of the brownfields landscape, and that we still have so many sites remaining to be addressed. And he also emphasized that this is not just about property, but property on people with a focus on people. So Rep. Kildee is right on the money, no pun intended, in focusing on how economic markets favor those redevelopment opportunities that are already favorable, and expressing concern with the disproportionate allocation of public funds to sites that naturally attract redevelopment dollars. I've seen that personally over 30 years of private practice in the environmental arena. Rep. Kildee wants to swing the pendulum the other way, arguing that market-ready sites may not need as many federal dollars. I concur, and I think from a policy position, the coalition concurs. Rep. Kildee framed the challenge in a manner that really resonated with me, putting the cart and horse in the proper order when it comes to optimizing the most distressed and least likely to be developed places first by advancing an outsized share, he used the term disproportionate share, of federal brownfield dollars to these chronically disinvested sites in truly distressed communities. My ears perked up because this is a concept that the coalition generally and the Public Policy, Redevelopment Incentives, and Regulatory Partnerships Committee specifically have been supporting since its inception, and supporting not just in theory, but in practice by working on new funding programs and proposed legislation to advocate for in meetings with and correspondence to elected officials and staff, and by presenting witness testimony to Congress when given the chance. Rep. Kildee's remarks underscore the uniqueness of this moment, the extraordinary opportunity to tap into a generational level of brownfields funding from the federal government. So for those who are out there watching us today, keep your ears to the ground for specific funding announcements. They're going to come fast and furious. And if you're looking for a competitive edge to pursue that funding, see if you can fashion an argument that your site has suffered specifically, acutely, from big changes in the global economy. Again, Rep. Kildee's words, and that your site is a trade impact site. This is a unique insight and planning strategy that I don't think has surfaced in the trade press yet, or otherwise been telegraphed in any of the anticipatory funding announcements.
That is an incredibly astute insight, Michael. Thank you for highlighting that, because I think Rep. Kildee, coming from Flint, has seen very dramatically the impacts of the global change in industrialization and where products are being made, and the sites that are being abandoned in the US as a result. So really interesting point of leverage there, I think, for how to use these funds. Lee, let's turn to you. What resonated in his remarks with you?
Well, first of all, I want to take up his charge to activate our members and educate our state and federal representatives. That's what the coalition does. That's why we're here today. And of course, I'm very excited that Congress has appropriated additional EPA funding for brownfields and Superfund. As he said, contaminated land's a problem in all types of communities. And in addition to the opportunity for larger grant amounts that EPA has put out there, I hope EPA is going to get well beyond the current rate of only 1/3 of their applicants getting grant awards. So We'll look to see how EPA doles out the grant money this year, but the additional funds are a great opportunity. So that was great to hear about. It was also interesting for me to hear him say that private financing can take care of sites with identified end uses, and that we are going to pay to address contamination in distressed areas, either with public dollars for remediation or through the negative impacts on communities. It's so important to recognize that, and he gets the importance of funding brownfield revitalization and capacity building and community empowerment about the end uses. Just when he talks about distressed communities, whether it's in the infrastructure law or through trade impacts, this has to mean both the smaller communities that have experienced disinvestment, as well as neighborhoods within larger cities that suffer from racial inequity, poor health, and threats of gentrification. We have that all over the place.
Thank you, Lee. I would note that what really resonated for me in Rep. Kilde's remarks was the issue of capacity. It's been something I've been very focused on, is that it seems a lot of the Brownfields funds are going to beef up the EPA grants as they exist, and yet communities have to have a certain level of capacity to even apply for those grants, much less win and administer those grants once the money is there. And so I think that those funds too have gone toward communities that already have capacity and programs and staffing and resources to apply them. And I think it's very exciting, this concept of let's use the resources of the coalition and of Smart Growth America and of CClear to reach those communities who need capacity building, who need the assistance in obtaining and deploying the additional funding that's being made available. So that was a point that really struck home with me. We've got a couple of comments in chat that I want to get to, but first of all, because the coalition is doing such important work right now at this pivotal time, Lee, can you share how you're involved with the National Brownfield Coalition and what you see as the opportunities for the coalition as we go into this new year?
Absolutely. It has been very exciting this year to work on a renewal of the federal brownfield tax incentive. Briefly, until 2011, this incentive allowed brownfield developers to fully deduct the costs of environmental remediation in the year the costs were incurred. This was, as my office is fond of saying, the most powerful thing the federal government ever did for brownfields. And I say that not to downplay EPA's excellent brownfield program, but EPA relies on appropriations of grant dollars that may or may not be awarded, as you just referenced. The power of the brownfield tax incentive is that it was baked into the tax code, provide more certainty about brownfield financing and encouraging investment in cleanup. And it was used all over the country. The coalition did a study in 2015 showing that it was used at least 625 times in more than 40 states. We'll put a link to the study and to the coalition's one-pager about this tax incentive in the chat. But this year ahead, through this past year, the coalition generated about 150 messages to Congress about renewing the tax incentive, and Representatives Sherrill and Turner introduced HR 4427 in July. So this is on Congress's radar, and you can be sure we're going to be working on this bipartisan bill next year. And I'm also on the coalition's Environmental Justice Committee. We talked about a lot with Representative Kildee, and we want to see investments going to frontline communities that have been affected by poverty and pollution. And a few of us participated in a conversation with EPA earlier this week about displacement and gentrification in brownfields, and issues that came up was the need for more affordable housing, creating high-wage working class jobs, and land ownership through things like community land trusts. The idea that communities, not just the developers, the people with the deep pockets, have a say in how land is reused. So the coalition's likely going to be presenting webinars about that this year, and I encourage people to get involved.
Thank you, Lee. And that's very good advice. Get involved. We all need to. Michael, how about you? What are you going to be involved with in the coming year? And where do you see the coalition being most effective?
Well, Mary, thank you. Last Wednesday, I had the privilege of presenting testimony on behalf of the coalition as one of 5 invited witnesses at a hearing before the House Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment titled Promoting Economic and Community Redevelopment and Environmental Justice in the Revitalization and Reuse of Contaminated Properties. The invitation came to the coalition, because the subcommittee staff is aware of the coalition's lengthy involvement in these issues and felt that we represented credentialed practitioners, local government officials, and community stakeholders with perspective born of experience and expertise. We were able to present all of the major policy initiatives under consideration by the coalition that we feel can translate into more resources and better tools for impacted communities. The federal income tax deduction for remediation that Lee just spoke about, a major boost for affordable housing development by increasing low-income housing tax credit percentages under existing programs, and creating an entirely new LIHTC subsidy out of whole cloth. The enactment of a new massive, I hope, federal loan guarantee program for Brownfields redevelopment, which we think would instantly bring billions of dollars off the sidelines from the private sector. And finally, also entirely new, and now something, frankly, we're super excited about in light of Rep. Kilde's emphasis on putting the cart and the horse in the proper order, a new markets tax credit program, but for brownfields specifically. Something we're calling, at least for now, new markets tax credits for high distress, long-term redevelopment brownfield sites. We also had an opportunity before the subcommittee to affirm our support for the Justice 40 initiative and to encourage greater involvement by a host of other executive agencies in the Federal Brownfields Partnership. In addition, we feel that there are more resources that can be brought to bear by these agencies, funding resources, technical resources, in-kind support that are very much aligned with the Brownfields mission. And we'd like to see the Army Corps and the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy and HUD and others similarly positioned to take up the cause as well. So we made that view known as well. And Mary, I anticipate doubling down on all of these activities and these initiatives in 2023 and 2022. And that's where I need to put on my sales hat, just like Lee did. We're not going to be able to do this alone. The concepts and initiatives that we presented to the House Subcommittee in our testimony, which require a serious policy home to incubate and percolate, they have such a home with the National Brownfields Coalition, but we need more chefs in our kitchen. So if you love Brownfields policy and are personally, culturally, corporately, institutionally, emotionally, truly, madly, deeply committed to this hard, challenging, exciting, rewarding, and important work, we would love for you to join us. Expand our
Truly,
perspective,
madly, deeply. Yes.
add to our knowledge base by adding your unique voice and your constituency's voice. The dues are modest, but the returns are huge, both personally and at the local level and at the national level.
Couldn't have said it better, Michael. Truly, deeply, madly. Yes.
All those things.
Brownfields, all those things. Yes, it's wonderful. And I think hopefully our participants are getting a sense of the both the passion and dedication, as well as the breadth of engagement in the National Brownfields Coalition. It is truly a wonderful vehicle through which to move the needle nationally on brownfields policy and the work that we all do in our personal and professional lives. Thank you for your insights and your comments there. I think we're going to turn next in the time we have left to a couple of questions from the audience. There has been, as I noted earlier, robust dialogue in the chat for those of you who are following it on a number of really important topics. I apologize in advance, we're not going to get to all of them, but I'm going to field one question to you both and ask you to comment briefly on it. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And the comment is, there is an inherent conflict between development that municipal governments would like to see in a distressed area to generate taxable income and projects that advance and just basically tax revenue and other more commercial goods, and projects that advance other social goods that community groups would like to see, but that may not produce a lot of income for the municipality. Can you discuss the tension between a municipality's desire to have a revenue producing project and a community's desire to have perhaps something that's more in the social good category? And does the new legislation address this equity issue? Michael, can you want to take that one first?
Well, actually, because Lee is in the local government business, I'm going to defer to Lee. And then
Good
I'll
point.
follow up after she presents her remarks.
Sure, we see this often. I mean,
That you
a
do.
lot of it comes down to land ownership. And sometimes it's the city that owns the land and has a big parcel, and what's it going to do with it and what are needs. We're acutely aware of the need for affordable housing in addition to jobs, and that often plays out on a local level between elected officials. One thing we did talk about in this recent conversation with EPA was more opportunities for community ownership, and the idea of community land banks and community land trusts, I think, are new, not missing, maybe not so new, but more frequent tools that we're looking at to think about how do we balance those needs, because people want parks and people want jobs and people need places to live. So there's not one clear answer for how to do that. It's different in different communities, but I think we're becoming aware of more tools for that, and environmental justice initiatives to make sure that the people who live in communities and have been there for a long time have an opportunity to meaningfully participate and influence that. I'm excited to see how that goes.
All right, Michael?
Yeah, from my perspective, I would underplay, with all due respect to the party presenting the question, the tension. I think those tensions are reconcilable and they're not inconsistent or perpetually at odds with each other. And what I mean by that is this. First of all, to the extent that we have a market-based redevelopment site that takes public dollars for remediation, puts them into a project that generates jobs and tax revenues, those tax revenues fund public services, which in theory go back to the community and create a level of social good. So that's number one. Number two, I would point out to something that Rep. Kildee said. He spoke to a broad portfolio of brownfield projects. And so it's appropriate to allocate fairly and equitably federal dollars to projects that will create jobs and economic activity, as well as those projects that may be more community oriented in terms of recreation, open space, gathering space, cultural activities, and the like. And I'd also emphasize a wonderful concept introduced by Rep. Kildee, and that is advanced funding of brownfields redevelopment in the most distressed, least likely to be developed places. And this also goes to the funding concept we're working on within the coalition, and that is a standalone brownfields program that isn't driven by economic reuse. This new markets tax credits program for brownfields redevelopment, highly distressed long-term redevelopment sites, where, as Rep. Kildee suggested, you could clear out all of the environmental and public health risks on the front end without having a reuse readily available, so that the community can take time to figure out what this site wants to be. And once you remove the environmental and public health stigma through this perhaps new funding mechanism, then that reuse will be better positioned to come more clearly into focus and won't be hamstrung by an economic driver that doesn't necessarily exist.
Let me ask you a follow-on question to that, because I took note of that in the interview with Rep. Kildee. Doesn't that imply that you then must do a cleanup to unrestricted use? And what does that say about our risk-based cleanup approach?
Oh my God, that's 3 days worth of seminar right there.
It is. So think about that for a minute. Jim, who was one of our interviewers with Representative Kildee, wanted to weigh in here briefly. Jim, what is your comment?
Thanks, and I'll follow up to Michael and to this topic, which is because I have decades of experience as a planner, all right, and in Flint with Rep. Kildee when he was at Genesee Land Bank. And the mantra that got developed in Flint was the government went to the people, okay? In other words, and they charretted. What I mean by, if you understand the word charrette, or you engage with the citizenry. So, and it doesn't have to, it can happen decision process and then look to the engine of private investment to actually generate the value, as Michael said, to immediate site, but it can be done simultaneously as well. It requires creativity at the local government level to actually bring those elements together to actually make it work. But we have all seen, on the panel and across the country, examples where that works. That's the ethic that has to get developed. And government's role in that is actually facilitate that engagement at local level with the engine of investment and actually part of that process.
Well, thank you for that comment, Jim. Let's turn to another audience question. And I honestly will ask you to help me interpret this because I'm not quite sure what they're referring to. The 4 levels of remediation creates a bias for and incentivizes low value projects. How could this be rethought? Is that a known concept, Michael or Lee, the 4 levels of remediation?
Well, I've never heard that concept before, but I want to reference something that we heard in the great interview that Jim did. Congratulations, Jim, with Rep. Kildee. That really was a remarkable interview, and the wheels are turning. I believe he talked about the concern that certain types of redevelopment projects on formerly industrial sites, given economic realities and the types of cleanups that are implemented, tend to attract the same type of use that caused the insult to public health and the environment in the first instance. And that may be what this question goes to. Are we putting in place an economic model that perpetuates the type of use that will continue to generate brownfield concerns and risks, public health risks, disinvestment risks, unequal access to opportunity risks? And is there a link to the way in which EPA can maybe break that chain through its relationship to local governments? My response is to, again, turn to Jim and the planning community. If you have involved stakeholders and smart planners and a really pungent stew of transparency and good faith, I think that cycle resolves itself naturally. There's too much awareness going forward about the root causes for disinvestment and blight and environmental injustice and inequitable access to opportunity for that cycle to continue. I don't know that EPA needs to get into the local land use business. The local land use and planning authorities and stakeholders, I think, are doing a good enough job.
Well, thank you for that, Michael. Lee, we only have a couple minutes here, but very briefly, I want to give you an opportunity to respond.
Sure. Briefly, I think the question is about, in New York State, you can clean up to, it's a risk-based approach of cleaning up to industrial, commercial, restricted, residential, unrestricted standards. And I might be misinterpreting the question, but in our experience, it's not those levels that drive the cleanup and the end use. It's that somebody has an idea in mind of what is going to be viable on that site, and how much more investment it takes to get to each level is generally driven by what somebody wants to put there. And so if there's a community vision for a higher use, maybe we need to do more coalition building around that to get people to clean up to the less restricted levels.
I think that's a really good point. And we get into challenges between community desires and market realities and what is, possible in the real estate world versus what's possible when the public takes the lead, working with the community in advancing some of the local desires.
Mary?
I hate, yes, sir.
I know we're going to wrap up shortly, but I want to tie Lee's comment to your question, which prompted my gut reaction of that would require a 3-day webinar. The issue that you brought up and that Lee addressed goes to the continued viability of the concept of risk-based corrective action and how that implicates and influences the economic underwriting, the public health underwriting, the equity underwriting of redevelopment sites. The scientific principles are still sound, right? Risk-based corrective action provides for institutional controls and engineering controls to prevent direct exposure to contaminants, percolation of stormwater into impacted soils, inhibiting the contamination of groundwater. So we've got those fundamentals that have long been in place, but are those fundamentals now being upended and disrupted by what we're learning in terms of climate change? It's just one example, right? Because now the risk is no longer exclusively from above with stormwater percolating through contaminated soil. It's sea level rise lifting up through contaminated soil and maybe upsetting engineering controls. So this is the type of very specific and important policy matter that we struggle with and deal with within the coalition and within our public policy committee that then gets taken to our advocacy committee and out back into the world. And if those of our audience listening are intrigued by any of this and want to get involved in any of it and influence the conversation and the dialogue, again, in closing, we encourage you to join the National Brownfields Coalition. We need your voice. We need your participation.
And on that note, I think you'll have a hearty second and third from Lee and I. Michael, thank you so much. Lee, thank you. It was such a pleasure talking with both of you and seeing you. I look forward to being able to get together in person again. To all of our attendees, thank you. I hope you enjoyed and got some value out of this presentation. If you did, please consider joining the coalition and join in these kinds of engaging conversations in the future. There's lots more fascinating developments in front of us on the Brownfields front as legislation moves forward. With that, happy holidays, everyone. Stay safe, be happy, and thank you for coming.